Hello, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues. Welcome you to the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology at University of Vienna. My first duty is to introduce our lecturer today, our guest Johann Angeler, but I think for most people, actually, he would not need an introduction, but you never know, as I said, to most people. And I just want to say about a few things in Johann's life without surprising. And I have known each other for quite a number of years, for several decades, I would say. So I was known him as a student in policy and history. So he studied in this very department. It's totally different back then, but we already had this. So I think you forever. And after finishing with his master, he moved to the Netherlands, to Leiden, and worked on his PhD doing research, long-term research field work in Sumatra among Batak people. And he's done a very thorough job, I think, a very detailed study, which ended up in his PhD on Batak society, social structure, religious institutions, ritual, and you name it. So if any of you wants to know anything about Batak culture, you can consult his PhD thesis, which we have in our library as well. After several years in the Netherlands, Johann and his family, they moved back to Austria, to Ternitz, now in...
First to Indonesia.
Okay, yeah. I wanted to talk about Indonesia, but I wasn't sure anymore what was first. Because the family also has a house in West Sumatra, in Minangkabau area. Very beautiful country, very beautiful house too. And so he was lucky enough, you can say, to spend also a few years in Indonesia. So you can already imagine, for those who don't know him very well, that Johann is also multilingual, that he speaks Dutch fluently, but also Bahasa Indonesia, Bahasa Batak, and perhaps some other Indonesian languages, Minangkabau, I don't know, but you can tell us later. As I mentioned in the beginning, I've known Johann or Hans, as I call him, and many others. I've known Hans for many years. And I've also known or learned to appreciate of him his generosity, I would say, not only as a host, that visitors are always welcome, but also in sharing his knowledge and experience with us. And I think many of us have benefited over the years. And Hans was also the first person to introduce me a little bit, at least, to Indonesian culture and language back in 1986. So some of you can make the calculation how old we are now, the younger ones at least. And and what I think is also exceptional on the personal level is that Hans is probably one of those people, I would say, who is most interested really in what he's doing research on, has done research, and without thinking of, is this good for my career? Do I get a job? Can I make money with it, etc.? So it is purely his interest in the subject, and I think that comes through when talking to him and learning also about his experiences, his knowledge, etc. So I think we are privileged in a certain way that today Hans will share some at least of what he has collected over the years with us. And as you can see from the title, he still has a strong interest in Sumatra, but at the same time, he's also his big interest has widened and to think about how perhaps models that he found in Sumatran stateless societies, how that can perhaps be also of a kind of role model for other societies in Europe or even in other countries and other continents. So without further ado, I would hand over the floor, well, we're in the same floor, to Hans. And I look forward to hearing whatever you have to say about societies without a state in Sumatra and their relationship to nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabi, for this wonderful introduction. And good afternoon, and hello, everybody. Welcome. I recently read a manuscript by a Batak PhD student at the theological faculty of the Humboldt University. And according to this text, the Batak image of God in mythology expresses the upper world, the underworld, the earth, the cardinal directions, the cycle of time, and other phenomena. Put it simply, God is nature or nature is God. It's interesting to note that in 1956, the Batak Philip Lumban-Dobing received his doctorate from the University of Utrecht with a thesis on the belief of the Dobo-Batak high God, and says more or less the same thing, only in a completely different context. From the Batak Catholic side, more precisely from Anicetus Bonar Sinaga, the later Archbishop of Medan, who received his doctorate in cultural anthropology from the University of Leuven in Belgium. He was accused of devaluing traditional religion by insinuating an immanent Batak god, a pantheism for the Toba Batak. If a religion does not proceed from the transcendence of God, it can only be primitive and therefore worthless. The success of the Catholic among the Batak, however, is based on the fact that they integrate parts of the old religion into Catholicism. That is called inculturasi in Indonesia. Sinaga himself described the Batak concept of God as both immanent and transcendent. This leaves open possibilities for the Catholic inculturation. The even larger Protestant church, the Huria Christen Batak Protestant, or HKBP, which emerged from the German Batak mission, rejects traditional religiosity across the board. The PhD student from the Humboldt University writes against a completely different background. She has worked for years as a Bibelfrau, or Bible woman, for the HKBP, and has seen many social and ecological problems in the villages for which neither the church, nor capitalism, nor the state have answers. She tries to formulate an eco-theological paradigm. But this is not possible if God is understood as transcendent and separate from creation. That means separate from nature. She suspects that solutions to today's problems can be found in old animism, and even pleads for re-mythologization, for recognition of the old ideas where they still live. I do hope she will not be excommunicated by her church. The Batak discourse already shows that the traditional relationship to nature is not simply a mundane thing. I don't want to give a theological lecture today, and I also want to stay away from esoteric approaches. I'm more concerned with cultural anthropological state of research on Sumatran societies without the state and their relationship to nature and what we can learn from this about political thinking in such societies. To define these societies by something they don't have is a bit unfortunate because it's actually about them having the ability to self-organize. I would prefer to call them self-organizing societies, but this term might appear to be confusing. I'll not talk only about the Batak not about the Batak only, but I have a comparative look at 5 self-organizing societies in Sumatra and their relationship to nature. The Orang Rimba, most of whom live as hunter-gatherers in Jambi.
Sorry,
Jambi,
you have a point. You should have a point. Yeah. Ganz oben.
Does this work? Naja, you see Jambi, yeah. Yeah, they are the only nomadic hunter-gatherer societies in Sumatra. The inhabitants of the island of Siberut, as well as the Petalangan in Riau, they are sedentary, but they live in a close contact with the jungle. They clear pieces of jungle and cultivate the land for a few years, after which they leave the land to clear a new piece of land, and the jungle comes back again. The jungle is always present, alternating with the cultivated land. The Minangkabau in West Sumatra, and the Batak in North Sumatra, they are numerically large societies, and they're sedentary, and both work permanent, mostly artificially irrigated rice fields. The physical and conceptual presence of the jungle is intrinsically linked to the social-political order of all of them. However, there are differences between these societies too. The Batak and the Siberut have organized their kinship patrilinearly. The Orang Rimba matrilinearly, and so do the Petalangan and the Minangkabau, who have also been Muslim for a long time. The Orang Rimba live almost permanently in the jungle, that is, within the wild, uncultivated nature. They find everything they need to live, and it's easy to see that nature is a source of blessing for them. By the way, contrary to some claims, the Orang Rimba, formerly known as Kubu, do have a rich spiritual life, as do all other traditional societies. Even food intake is not without spiritual connotations. The Orang Rimba in the Bukit 12 National Park in Jambi still eat only what they have gathered or hunted in the wild and refuse to eat anything what has been produced by sedentary farmers. They organize themselves in small matrilineal groups. That is, sisters stay together with their parents, and husbands move in, usually before having done bride service in their parents, for their parents-in-law for some time. In principle, the groups are organized in an egalitarian way, but they are hierarchical sounding titles. This has a lot to do with their relationship to the outside world. Today, a certain regional territoriality is reported, which is also defended against intruders if necessary, especially on the edges of the jungle. The orang rimba like to create gardens and plant rubber trees, which also have a defensive function against encroaching Malay farmers. There they build houses on stilts, but do not remain sedentary permanently. At latest, when someone dies, the whole group moves away back into the deep jungle to mourn there. And they do not come back to live at the place of death. The deep little Dutch jungle, the Rimbagodong, is considered cool and pure and particularly healthy. A good place for healing, for birth, and for shamanistic rituals. Access to the spiritual world, the Halam Hului, is easier there than elsewhere. This little Dutch jungle is a source of blessing for the orang rimba. The orang rimba prefer to stay nomads if they can. But what about the relationship to nature among sedentary people? The transition to sedentary life is considered a great turning point in human history. For some cultural scientists, sedentary life is considered, sedentary life is associated with the development of the evils of civilization. While hunter-gatherer societies maintain a balance with nature and egalitarian relationship among themselves, with sedentariness comes the development towards the exploitation of nature and social stratification, as well as oppression of man by man. Everything is usually attributed to sedentariness. This should be seen in a more differentiated way. Based on the knowledge of the culture of the inhabitants of Siberut, Reimar Schefold has worked out the concept of the sources of blessing. Schefold, who has been researching among the Siberut since the 1960s, and he still occasionally visits them, works in the tradition of the Leiden school, which in turn has developed from the influence of the Durkheim school of sociology since the 1920s. In short, it is about gaining a view of the whole and trying to understand how the individual elements of the whole relate to each other. In addition to individual cultures, the Indonesian field of study is also taken as a whole, which is assumed to have a certain homogeneity due to common origins. After all, it is certain that the Austronesian-speaking language, the inhabitants of the Austronesian-speaking inhabitants immigrated from East Asia a few millennia ago. The comparative research method makes it possible to interpret certain cultural elements that cannot be sufficiently understood from a single particular culture in comparison with what is known about comparable elements in other cultures. Until not so long ago, the island of Siberut was 90% covered with jungle. The approximately 20,000 local residents live along the rivers in communal houses called Umma. They're in small patrilineally organized groups of about 5 to 10 families. Their political organization is strictly egalitarian. There is no dominant leadership among them. If the group becomes too large, sooner or later a conflict arises. And if this cannot be no longer resolved, some of the inhabitants move away and found a new Ummah, new house. The founding of a new Ummah is not just building a house, it is the founding of a new political entity. And something like that is basically a dramatic thing. In the context of this new foundation, the importance of the wilderness as a source of blessing becomes particularly clear. Schefold has described three sources of blessing for Siberut. One's ancestors, one's bright givers, and the wilderness. All three sources are important for people's overall well-being, but what matters most is the relationship with wild nature and what it represents. Actually, wild nature is, in its essence, is not a locally definable concept. The Siberut imagined this as a kind of other dimension in which a culture of beyond, as Schefold calls it, is established and effective. The people imagine this to be quite well ordered, but different from the human world. It happens sometimes that people, mostly children or young people, disappear into the jungle for a while and then reappear and report ecstatically about their experiences in the other world. Their relatives worry then about these people. They fear that they no longer want to stay in the human world and will soon die. Then it is important to take good care of them ritually. Of course, the world of wild nature is also associated with dangers. But above all, it is the nourishing source of the nourishing source of everything that is important to people. Health, fertility, peace, a good life, and also the success of the founding of a new political unit, a Ummah, a house. For the Siberut, the essential thing about the founding of the house is the holding of the appropriate rituals, which are more important than the physical construction of the house, because by means of these rituals, the relationship with the other world are established and the relationship between people are strengthened. That's what matters, and I think they also build good houses. However, I said the establishment of a new political Ummah, the establishment of a new political entity, is a dramatic event, and it is not easy to explain all the different concepts involved. I find it particularly difficult to interpret the fact that in the past, the ritual establishment of a new Ummah also included headhunting. Headhunting was banned in colonial times, but Schefold was able to interview several informants who took part in such hunts in their youth. For the inhabitants of the valley in which Schefold had been researching, the hunting ground was never nearby, never among neighbors, but far away, in a region where they believed to it has been first settled. In other words, with those groups from which they believed to be descended. Often victims were from the same clan as the hunters, but no attention was paid to this. They killed whoever they caught first and brought home the severed head. A successful hunt triggered a phase of intensive creative work in the new Ummah community. Carvings have been made and rituals have been held, and the relationship with the other world, with the world of nature, could definitely be established. Of course, this relationship with the other world, as well as the relationship between people, must be ritually strengthened again and again. And this is, for example, one ritual here. And the Siberut take a lot of time for this. As Schefold emphasizes, an essential aspect of these rituals, which are held for several times a year and last for weeks. It is a way of being that is different from everyday life. In which rules of coexistence within an egalitarian society are also experimented with. This usually leads to the insight among the participants of that anti-social or competitive individualistic behavior is harmful and therefore to be rejected. Otherwise, the Siberut usually raise their children without any coercion or pressure, only by setting a good example. Ritual learning is effective. In the other area, in Rio, the Pedalangan, is the relationship with the wilderness very similar. They also live along rivers, and they build good houses, yeah. And the jungle provides everything they need. And yeah, just a little bit, yeah. And your children learn how to build houses in a playful way. On the surface, the Pedalangan society looks rather hierarchical, but this has a lot to do with their long-standing relationship with the Malay kingdom of Pelalawan. In fact, life among the Pedalangan is also organized in an egalitarian way within the existing structures. And there I was able to experience personally what it feels like to live in a constant, intimate contact with the invisible but not inaccessible spiritual world of nature. In maintaining contact with the world of nature, the shaman healer, the musician, and the assistants who support him play an important role for society, but they do not wield any political power. Now to the Minangkabau and the Batak. They are, as said, numerically much larger societies than the inhabitants of Siberut or Pedalangan. Yeah, we are talking about 500,000 to 1 million inhabitants of the central Batak lands in pre-colonial time, this over 200 years ago, and at least as many in the Minangkabau highlands. Growing artificially irrigated rice on permanent fields yields much more than shifting cultivation, but necessarily requires cooperation on a larger scale. How do they achieve this? Yeah, these irrigation channels are several kilometers. They built this in pre-colonial time in the rock, and they have to be maintained. How can they do this without letting conflict jeopardize vital cooperation and without leaders being able to and also without being leaders being able to exploit their position for their own gain and oppress their fellow human beings. Neither the Batak nor the Minang are conflict-free societies, and personal ambitions for power can exist there as everywhere else. The answer is that the Batak and the Minang have developed a functional political system that was precisely tailored to their needs. As much hierarchy as necessary to ensure cooperation on a sufficiently large scale, but not so much to enable the oppression of man by man. This worked well at the level of the village. And also people like to live in small groups, but also at the level of a maximum irrigation unit. In these political units, called bios among the Batak, Nagari among the Minangkabau, thousands or tens of thousands of people usually lived and worked together as basically equal people without slavery. There were not only male forms of organization, but women also were organized. I know more details from this from the situation with the Batak, but also with the Minang, where the position of women is stronger than in patrilineal society. Anyway, there are indications that women were also organized in the past. They even had a representative at the highest levels. One of the three kings was female. And all of this also worked through the relationship with wilderness. But let's look first at where the wilderness, the physical jungle, is spatially located. The Batak and the Minangkabau no longer live alternately with the wilderness, but at a distance from it. That is how it seems. In fact, the wilderness and its spiritual dimension are conceptually essential even in the immediate vicinity of their villages. The Minangkabau have managed to preserve most of their forest on the elevated areas. Traditionally, the forest is not cleared without necessity. You just replant what you have taken. At the edges, preferably with fruit trees. The landscape in central Batakland, on the other hand, has been free of trees for centuries. Hence the name Toba Nasai, the bare Toba. Nevertheless, it is a sustainable ecosystem. In addition to rice cultivation, it also enables extensive livestock breeding, and the tree-free grass areas can be planted with rice at certain intervals. And everywhere, there are still particular remnants of primeval forest, which are strictly protected by taboos. Often, these are both hydrological reserves and sacred groves. And it is not uncommon for the highest deity to manifest itself in such places. In addition, there are also enclaves of wilderness called Homban in the middle of the cultural area, which the land-taking group had exempted from clearing at the time of the original settlement. Each Homban is assigned to a socio-political unit that was ritually founded at the time of the land-taking. Each of these foundations is also to be understood as a house foundation and cannot be carried out by a single group of descent. How this happened centuries ago, we can only reconstruct by drawing conclusions about how it happened in historical times. Batak authors from the colonial area have left detailed reports. The importance of such foundations has long remained hidden from foreign observers. After all, such an event is rarely observed. In the meantime, however, we know well that these foundations are decisive for the political order in stateless societies throughout Southeast Asia, including Burma, Thailand, Laos. In such founding rituals, in such a founding ritual, in Batak called Martua Oma Oma, different groups come together, but at least 3 families, not all of which can be from the same clan or marga among the Batak. At least one family must come from a pride-taking clan. The decisive ritual activity the decisive ritual activity, the presentation of offerings, is carried out by the wives. Only women can make direct contact with the spiritual forces of nature. But they are not on this picture. If they succeed to make contact with the powers of nature and obtain their consent for to the foundation, the place of contact becomes a homban. That means it was spared from the clearing. It becomes a sacred place where the descendants of the founders could present offerings and make contact again and again in order to reconfirm an existing order of relationship with nature and among humans. Of course, these enclaves of original wilderness could no longer be created during later foundations and repeated rituals, because there was no longer any wilderness to clear. Therefore, for all foundations or rituals that are intended to repeat the original foundation, various plants are taken from the jungle in a small symbolic world mountain. A puhit is piled up, and also a symbolic tree which functions as a porotan, a bowl for tying a sacrificial animal to it. In addition to a mythological upper, middle, and lower world, which is a manifestation of a past Hindu influence, the Batak also distinguish between the Portibi Hasyangan, the world of light, visible to all people, and the Portibi Hahomion, the secret, invisible world, which is to be seen as the actual source of all life. The invisible world encompasses the visible world, but is also present in the uterus. A child grows up in the Portibi Hahomion, and then it comes into the world of light through birth. It is still considered a partially spiritual being for a while, for whom one must take good care of, both physically and ritually. Only when the child grows teeth is the transformation into a real person complete. A vagina in ritual symbolism is considered axis and entry point to the Portibi Hahomion, as well as a symbol of the whole cosmos with all cardinal directions. Just as the secret world encompasses our visible world, in some rituals, therefore, a Desanavalu symbol is drawn around the artificially created wilderness, which is a vagina as well as a cosmos symbol. As the Batak say, it symbolizes order and harmony between people and with nature. And this is why this symbol is often part of the wood carvings on houses, gorga. There are also reports of religious erotic aspects of the annual repetition rituals of a Martua Oma Oma. There seem to have been important aspects of human life involved, from birth to sexuality to death. Like the Orang Rimba move into the Rimba Godong, the deep forest, after a case of death, to reconsolidate themselves as a group, like the inhabitants of Siberut after an insoluble conflict found a new political community, founding a new ummah, a house, which is only possible through the relationship with the spiritual forces of nature, in which headhunting is also played has also played a role in the past. That is the death of a human being. So also among the Batak, the founding of a new house, which is also the founding of a new political entity, is only possible through the relationship with the spiritual powers of nature. And there have also been reports of human sacrifices, headhunting, and ritual fighting in the past. And the physical presence of the wilderness is also necessary. The homban, or if not otherwise possible, wild nature is created for the duration of the rituals by taking certain plants out of the jungle. Through this ritual, associated with it, the representatives of different groups can enter into a relationship with the forces of nature and with each other, in which a certain order is already laid out. The descendants of the family of participating in the founding ritual, provide group representatives with different tasks. Representatives of the group of the older line can collectively make decisions for society as a whole. These are called Pangulu by the Batak and also Pangulu by the Minang. There, Minangkabau and West Sumatra, they still have an important role as representatives of local groups, but may be able to make certain fundamental decisions concerning the traditional order for the entire Minangkabau nation. The Batak call them also Barbaringin, because they were branches of the Baringin tree, a ficus species, and a very important wilderness symbol on their heads during rituals. The Babaringin or Pangulu collectively represent the highest legislative authority. They are also mediators in conflicts, but their powers are limited by numerous taboos. For example, they are not allowed to shed blood or touch weapons. Representatives from younger lines had other tasks, including ensuring security. They were allowed to arm themselves, but they were obliged to abide by the decisions of the Babaringin. And the colonial power recruited leaders from this category for its indirect rule system, but called them secular leaders, but that didn't work because the people didn't recognize them. Perhaps that's why this institution has disappeared today, while Babaringin organizations still exist. The respective wives of the representatives formed women's organization that could effectively stand up for women's rights in addition to spiritual tasks and ritual tasks. These women, called Banyaran, also wear plants from the jungle on their heads during rituals, usually certain fern species that grows on trees. Yeah? They were the most important direct contact with the spiritual world, as the spiritual powers could speak directly via them. Therefore, at the end of an important ritual, the highest representatives of the region bowed to these women. Marsomba, they called it. In this order that has grown out of the foundation ritual, there is already the possibility of representing the group, as well as the control of the representatives themselves. A certain hierarchy, but that cannot easily be abused. A hierarchy that makes it possible to organize the necessary cooperation without which the artificial irrigation of the rice fields could not function, and thus the feeding of large numbers of people. If the water doesn't come, the harvest will fail. But at the same time, it is also in the service of community, and that's what it needs. This hierarchy is under the spiritual control of the forces of nature, as well under the social control, and this can be considered doubly subdued. When the Batak create a new political organization, the concept of how this organization is to function is already fixed from the outset. Or rather, it is already clear what the basic relationships should look like. There is no provision for any power struggle in this system. And this relationship to wild nature, the relationship to wild nature is quite different in societies with the state or dynastic societies, as Schefold calls them. This is where the strongest contrast can be found within the Indonesian field of study. The wilderness is no longer a source of blessings, but a place of dangerous monsters that only the king or prince can overcome. Once a ruler is established, it becomes the source, he becomes the source of blessing for the population. As the Javanologist Ben Anderson has so beautifully pointed out, in Javanese text, the king is described as a double funnel that catches all the cosmic blessings which come from above and passes it down to the population. The king is thus the sole source of blessing for the people, and his task is to subdue not only enemies, but also the wilderness. This can be found not only in Javanese, but also in Sundanese and Malay texts, even in the Sejarah Melayu, a text that also refers to the Minangkabau royal family. In reality, this concept remained only in the texts, because the people had succeeded in more or less domesticating the royal family and retaining its ability to self-organize. The royal institution among the Minangkabau originally came into the country from outside. It is a rare form of the ideal ruler, as Lao Tse described in the Tao Te Ching. He doesn't have to do anything, and everything will turn out well, because the population can organize itself well. But as said, this is a rare form. As a rule, the primary state arises as a result of war and subjugation, and the victorious leaders and their associates permanently dominate the rest of society. And most importantly, domination is not only maintained by force of arms, but is also ideologically secured as can be read in old Indonesian texts or in our media today. I believe that the invention of the sedentary life was the prerequisite for, but not in itself, the great turning point in the history of mankind. In reality, this was the invention of systematic warfare aimed at submission in combination with its ideological legitimacy. People thought very differently before than they did afterwards. By the way, our thinking is still determined by this war paradigm, as I call it. This is the paradigm that pervades our way of thinking about the world and social relationship. everything has to be fought for in politics, in the economy, in actual wars between individuals, between parties, within parties, companies, states, etc. We believe that this is the nature of things, but this is not certain. What is certain, however, is that nothing has influenced people in the last few millennia as much as the experience of warfare. Whether you win or lose is all decisive. It decides whether you survive, whether you are enslaved or not, etc. Therefore, nothing is more important than being well prepared for war. And that works best when you work well together, when you can act as one. A warring group must be welded together intensively. Therefore, one subordinates oneself as completely as possible to a single leader. Such a group is more successful in war than an egalitarian group. Such individual leaders have appeared all over the world when systematic warfare became important. Thus, kingship was invented, and the relationship to wild nature began to change fundamentally. Complicated rituals were no longer needed. Cooperation could simply be forced, and civilization as we know it could develop. The paradigm of war had a double character from the beginning. On the one hand, it made cooperation possible on large scale. And cooperation can bring many advantages. On the other hand, it enabled parasitic, exploitative behavior by the power-wielding elites, against which an unorganized society can hardly defend itself. This contradiction has not been resolved yet, not even with today's form of democracy. And by the way, the other side of the coin is in Java since the 12th century and elsewhere even longer, the belief that the Ratu Adil will come, a just king, a savior who leads the people to a happy life. Self-organization seems no longer to be an option. Yeah, self-organizing societies change their environment too, but they seek balance with nature as well as with each other, and they integrate balance into their institutions. What can be learned from these societies is that if people can choose, they prefer to stick to their egalitarian way of life and make sure that no one can oppress them. But they can agree to some form of political hierarchy under control of society, if necessary for the well-being of the community as a whole. Political order does not necessarily have to consist of struggle for victory or pecking order. People can very well organize themselves and work together, and their spiritual relationship with nature, their awareness of the multiple ways of being intrinsically connected to nature, that plays a decisive role in this. And sometimes a self-organizing society succeeds in remaining one, even though it already has the kingship. With the Minangkabau, this has worked for 300 to 400 years, and it turned out to be a good solution for both the population and the royalty. Just a few minutes more, yeah? I would like to say something about how war and subjugation came to the Minang and the Batak good 200 years ago as a result of ideas from outside. The paradigm of war did not initially come to the Minangkabau as well as to the Batak a little later through the Dutch or British colonialism, but through new ideas that Mecca pilgrims, so-called Padri, brought, had become acquainted with. Yeah? The Minangkabau had been converted to Islam since the 16th century, and this religion harmonized quite well with the traditional order of the Minang and the Southern Batak. What the Padri got to know at the Arabian Peninsula were the teachings and successes of the Wahhabis. They may have been particularly impressed by the life story of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, by the fact that his power political career began with the felling of a sacred tree, the destruction of a saint's grave, and the stoning of an adulteress in the oasis of Al-Uyayna. By the way, Saint Boniface or Bonifatius wasn't the only one who fought a people's spiritual relationship with nature in the name of religion, but with military backing. The Padri had learned that they no longer had to abide by traditional rules, and that gave them a decisive advantage. From 1803 onwards, they first conquered regional power, and in 1815, the Padri invited the royal family to negotiations in order to kill them off on this occasion. But one prince did escape, and in 1819, he turned to the Dutch, who entered the war in 1821. From 1825 onwards, the Padri also attacked the Bataclan and reduced the population by 3/4 in some areas. The attackers were to a large extent Muslim Batak themselves. As I said, it is not Islam as a religion that brought the war paradigm. For 300 years, this religion had harmonized well with the traditional order of the Minangkabau, just as it still does today among the Petalangan and in many Minangkabau villages. But the war paradigm can reshape and abuse any religion, even animism. In any case, the situation also changed among the Batak after 1825. It was hard for them to organize themselves quickly enough to defend themselves effectively, because individual leaders had little say. Over time, they learned it after all. But that came at the price. In the fighting, which dragged on for decades, some Batak leaders fought among themselves, and some adopted slavery, which has been the basis of the Padri's economy. The Batak adopted the Padri business model, so to speak. The Batak themselves spoke of this chaotic and warlike past as Tikini Pitari, the Padri time. However, in their traditional way of thinking, there is no hatred towards anybody. In their myths about this war, myths that surfaced soon after it, they see it as a tragic conflict among Batak, a conflict to learn from in order to avoid for the future. This is the same way as they talk about other past conflicts. Furthermore, not all of the Batak or Minang society was plunged into chaos and adopted slavery. The old system proved to be quite resilient, and in some areas it remained well preserved, or it returned after fighting had stopped. We don't know how this story would have ended for the whole of the country, because towards the end of the 19th century, Dutch colonialism began to establish itself in the central Bataklands. This takeover was completed around 1915, and the Batak's completely self-determined life was history. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hans, for giving such an insight, I would say, into many different aspects of West Indonesian societies, and also drawing such comparisons. And I would open the floor to questions, and of course, also those who participated or have participated via Zoom I invited to, I would say, to write their questions in the chat is perhaps the easiest. So, any questions or comments from the audience? Uwe?
Yeah, thank you very much for this insight, this brilliant presentation.